Bonjour, et de la part du Centre Raoul Wallenberg pour le droit de la personne, je voudrais souhaiter une chaleureuse bienvenue à tous et à toutes. We meet in the painful shadow of the events of Saturday, October 7th, which has been characterized as the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, of horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. As somebody who was in Israel on that day, the mass atrocities, the murder and maiming, the torture and rape of women, the burning and beheading of babies has indelibly imprinted itself not only on my memory, but on my psyche. And the hostages are a standing reminder and a continuing reminder of the inhumanity of that day and of the continuing crime against humanity. For us at the Raoul Wallenberg Center and the Human Rights Coalition that have joined us, the immediate and unconditional release of all the hostages has been a stand-alone obligation since October 7th, and so remains. Unrelated to wherever you may stand on the political issues, a stand-alone obligation, a humanitarian imperative of the first order, a moral imperative of the first order anchored in the foundational principle of humanity, a legal obligation of the first order because the hostages are a standing crime against humanity. Every day that they are held is yet another torturous day in captivity under Hamas, and an international legal responsibility of the first order. And so I'm delighted that the Canadian House of Commons became the first parliament to unanimously adopt a resolution condemning Hamas's mass atrocities and calling for the unconditional release of the hostages. That we have been joined by coalitions of human rights groups across Canada who have themselves experienced mass atrocities. I'm referring to the diasporas from Ukraine, from Iran, from Tutsis in Rwanda, and the like. And I'm delighted that, in particular, we are accompanied here this morning by the families of the hostages who are here to bear witness. So I'll just close by saying that we have come with a set of calls for action by our government. Those calls for action, and I'll only enumerate it for reasons of time, are: number one, targeted and comprehensive Magnitsky sanctions, whereby we join our allies in targeting the perpetrators of these mass atrocities and bring justice, measure of justice for the victims and accountability for these horrific violations. Second, to hold the Iranian leadership accountable. We forget that it is the Iranian leadership that has armed and trained and financed and incentivized and even celebrated these mass atrocities. Yet we have yet to put the IRGC on the terrorist list, something I recommended as a member of Parliament some 15 years ago, and which I reiterate again today. And we have yet to even sanction President Raisi of Iran, who is still welcomed in the international arena as we meet today. Third, that we initiate appropriate investigations and prospective prosecutions of those involved in the torture and murder of Canadians, whether it be at the music festival or otherwise, including my longtime friend Vivian Silver from Winnipeg, who was initially thought to have been a hostage, but then discovered that she was one of those brutally murdered on October 7th. And finally, the need for an international coalition so that this is a priority on the agenda of this international coalition. I know some members have votes and other commitments, so the procedure now is I'll ask one member from each party to just briefly say a few words, and then we'll turn it over to the families of the hostages who will bear witness and bring direct witness testimony. So let's start with our members of Parliament.
Mr. Housefather.
Sure. Just a few weeks ago, Michelle, Marco, Melissa, and I, and our colleague Marty Morantz, were in Israel. And we saw the horrors of October the 7th. We saw what was essentially a crime scene. The bodies were gone, but the smells, blood, bullet holes, and the memories remain. And this is etched and imprinted on Israelis and on Jewish communities throughout the world. The hostage families live a nightmare every single day. We're worried about what's happening to their loved ones in captivity, but they themselves are undergoing torture every day, not knowing what is happening with the fate of their loved ones, not knowing if their loved ones are safe or being tortured or worse. And anything we can do to achieve the release of the hostages immediately and unconditionally, as our resolution of the House stated, is absolutely essential. And as Erwin mentioned, Canada should be a leader in the field of sanctioning the perpetrators of this attack, Magnitsky sanctions on Hamas and all of their allies, and especially the perpetrators of the attack on October the 7th. And the IRGC absolutely needs to be listed as a terrorist entity. We voted for that in the House. It was years ago at this point. It was, I think, 4 or 5 years ago on a motion by Garnick Jenis. And this has to happen. This absolutely has to happen. Et je vous encourage, si vous n'avez pas regardé le compte de X, anciennement Twitter, de l'Ayatollah Khamenei, vous devriez le regarder. The Supreme Leader of Iran is constantly demanding the end of the State of Israel, what he calls a Zionist entity. The hate that he spouts in itself, as the leader of the country, merits strong sanctions on him personally and on his regime and on the RWCHR. So I'm glad to be joined here by Marco and Judy from my party, and I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Honored to be here on behalf of my colleagues, Michelle Rumpel and Garner and Melissa Landsman. Vivian Silver's brother lives in southwest Calgary in the riding in which I represent. This is a hostage who had been a peace activist building bridges between people, for which Hamas indiscriminately arrested and murdered. My colleague Melissa Landsman has a private member's bill before the House of Commons presently, combating this state terror statecraft used as state terror of hostage-taking practices. It would provide the government tools to combat how our country deals with these actors that Anthony had mentioned that are normalizing the practice of hostage-taking across the world. And more acutely than ever, what we see and what Hamas has done to the people of Israel, to the Palestinians themselves, is a horrifying advent in the scale of how hostage-taking is being used to try and circumvent freedom and democracy and human rights and the rule of law. So I'm honored to stand with an amazing cast of parliamentarians. I'm honored to stand with the victims and their families. They should be made aware that their whole country in Canada is standing with them until these hostages are released, and that this, there's discussion today about how we should be dealing with the conflict. Hamas has the ability to decide to end this war now. Hamas broke the ceasefire on October 7th. Hamas broke the ceasefire twice during a pause of conflict in which hostages are supposed to be released. Hamas has no objective except to eradicate the Jewish people in the state of Israel. It is backed by Iran, and that entire apparatus has to be dismantled now. So thank you.
Bonjour tout le monde. Il y a des moments en politique où il faut s'unir. Il faut s'unir au-delà des lignes partisanes. Lorsqu'on parle de droits humains, on ne parle plus de politique. Ce qui s'est passé le 7 octobre, ça a été un traumatisme pour tout le peuple israélien, mais ça a été un traumatisme pour toute la communauté internationale et je dirais pour tous ceux et celles qui croient en l'humanité. À partir du moment où un groupe terroriste détient des otages parce qu'il croit défendre une cause juste, nous, en tant que défenseurs des droits humains, on ne peut pas accepter ça. Et le seul appel possible, c'est la demande nécessaire et obligatoire de faire en sorte que les otages soient libérés à la seconde où on se parle. Aujourd'hui, je suis très heureux d'être avec mes collègues du Parlement, de presque tous les partis, mais soyons conscients que les demandes qui sont faites aujourd'hui, ils sont faites dans le cadre des droits humains. Et pour moi, c'est comme les Anglais disent, un no-brainer. Il faut absolument qu'on mette à côté nos ambitions politiques, nos lignes partisanes, la politique. De toute façon, peu importe les positions que l'on prendra sur le conflit actuel, ce qui est en train de se produire présentement, c'est un groupe terroriste qui a commis les pires atrocités qui soient le 7 octobre et qui détiennent des otages pour faire pencher la balance en leur faveur, ce qui est inacceptable. Nous soutenons donc aujourd'hui les demandes qui sont faites par le Centre Raoul Wallenberg, par la coalition des organisations de défense des droits humains. Et moi, je suis fier de représenter le Bloc québécois aux côtés de mes amis du Parti libéral et du Parti conservateur aujourd'hui. Je suis fier d'être en compagnie des familles d'otages qui se battent parce que c'est leur famille. C'est leur famille. Et nous, on se doit d'être à leur côté, de les soutenir. Et c'est ce qu'on fera jusqu'au bout, jusqu'à temps que tous les otages, jusqu'au dernier, soient libérés. Merci.
Merci, Alex, pour le Charles mot. Je vais demander de Brandon maintenant to introduce our families of the hostages.
Sure. Thank you for Professor Kotler and to all the members of Parliament here representing myriad parties in this House to make a clarion call for action on behalf of the hostages. We have here with us representatives of the Nutra family, Yehuda and Romi, and of the Lapidot family, Harel, who are here also on behalf of all the hostages, the initial 234 that were taken, 20 who had been murdered in captivity, and some who have been released in exchange for convicted murderers with blood on their hands. But they are here to share the story of their loved ones and to ask for strong action to ensure that those responsible for the hostage-taking are held accountable, that they cannot make use of the banks and businesses in Canada to continue their atrocities. So I'll now ask Yehuda and Romi to share of their loved ones.
Hello, my name is Yehuda Cohen. Small correction, I'm the father of Nimrod Cohen, who is a friend of Omer Nutra. And I will let my daughter, his twin sister, speak.
Hello, my name is Romi. This is my twin brother, Nimrod. On October 7th, my brother was kidnapped with his friends. One of them is Omer. We found out about it by watching a video that was released by Hamas on YouTube, and the whole country watched it. And we found out that way. We saw him taken captive. And since that day, we have no detail, not a single information. We don't know anything about his condition. if he's injured, if he's even alive. We don't know anything. And I want to say something else. There was a deal of hostages that were released, but many are still there, and we can't forget the men. My brother is 19, like me, and he's still a child. He's my parents' child. He's my twin brother, and we miss him, and we don't know anything, and we hope, if you can do anything that is in your power. We barely eat, we barely sleep, we don't function the same, and now it's the holidays, and the world is celebrating, but we're not. Hanukkah is a family holiday, and our family is broken. We can't celebrate Hanukkah. We can't light the candles like every year. And we hope this will end soon and as fast as possible. Thank you.
My name is RWCHR. I was born in Regina, Saskatchewan. I'm here with my brothers from Israel to support them, because we, as a family of Tiferet Lapidot that was murdered, we know what they're going through. We went through the same thing. For more than 11 days, Tiferet was considered as a hostage. We didn't sleep. We didn't eat. We didn't even take a shower. We felt that everything, every basic human thing that we are doing is a betrayal of them, because we know the conditions that they're held on. The fact that the money that was and is continuously flowing from Western world countries towards the Hamas, that's the exact money that killed my Tiferet. She was our sunshine. And they brutally murdered her. That money is the money in which they bought the bullets, in which they bought the truck that Tiferet was taken with, and afterward she was shot dead. Less than 1 year ago, I met Tiferet. We were on a vacation. She flew for 4 hours, and she took a train of 16 hours just to see and to meet me. And I hugged her and I took her on my arms like she was a baby. And she was brutally murdered. We know that for a fact. The families here are not standing here when their fear is not for nothing. They are afraid that the same thing would happen to them, to their beloved. We're urging you, and we're urging the Canadian government to stop the money to create enough power and sanctions in order to stop the money. Can you imagine that in the Second World War, money from Canada would go to the Nazis and be used against the Western world? It's unbearable. We can't think about that. So I'm here as a Canadian, as a human being, as a Jew, asking and pleading, do the right thing, be courage enough to do the right thing in order to stop the money. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah, I guess maybe to begin with, you're proposing individual sanctions today. Hamas is a listed terrorist organization in Canada. What would these sanctions do that the terrorist designation doesn't?
I'll ask Brandon Silver, who's prepared the whole terrorist list, to just respond to the question.
Sure. Well,
translation.
Sure. Thanks for that important question. And in the same way that Canada had listed the Al-Quds entity as a terror organization, and then the government proceeded to implement Magnitsky sanctions against its leadership in order to better prevent bypassing of sanctions, in order to name and shame the individual perpetrators involved, and in order to effectively ensure that enforcement is as fulsome as possible. And it would also bring Canada in line with our major G7 allies. The UK and the US has already implemented these targeted sanctions in addition to designating Hamas as a terrorist organization. And so that is for the entirety of the list. And the majority of those Hamas perpetrators have also been individually designated by France, Australia, and the European Union. So for these cases, Canada is an outlier, and we encourage the government to join our allies in naming, shaming, and ensuring enforcement of sanctions against those responsible for the atrocities that you just heard described.
While you're there, do you have any reason to think that the names you're identifying here have assets in Canada that the Canadian government could reach?
Well, the most important point is that the opacity of the way sanctions have been undertaken means we don't know. It's important that they be listed and that this be described. And we know for a fact, based on the excellent reporting of all of you, that the IRGC frequents Canada as a vacation destination, as an investment location, and that has to be put to an end because, as Professor Kotler said, they arm, train, fund those responsible for these atrocities. There's a direct line between the IRGC and the crimes you've heard described, and it is a mockery of the Canadian justice system and of our values as Canadians that they're given free rein in Canada.
I have a question for Mr. Kotler. Peut-être dans les deux langues officielles aussi, Mr. Kotler, but I'm wondering, it is maybe a simple, maybe a complicated question. Monsieur Brunet-Duceppe talked about this as a no-brainer. Why do you think the government has not moved forward on the sanctions in particular?
Sometimes governments move more slowly than they should and don't move as compellingly as they must. I think that the presence here of the families of the hostages is the best reminder that what we are experiencing is an ongoing crime against humanity. Every day that the abducted hostages are effectively, forcibly disappeared and very likely tortured is an ongoing crime against humanity. It's the responsibility, therefore, of the governments to undertake all the necessary means available in law, in policy, to hold those accountable. Otherwise, frankly, we indulge a culture of impunity. What we need is a culture of accountability, and that's why we have made the proposals today, proposals that should have been acted upon already, but it is still not too late to make the necessary targeted Magnitsky designations, to make the necessary IRGC listing, to make the necessary listing of Ibrahim Raisi. It's astonishing that Ibrahim Raisi is the president of Iran, was part of the initial death squad in 1988, responsible for the mass murder of over 5,000 Iranian dissidents at the time. He was then a deputy prosecutor. Was he held accountable? No. He was appointed as Attorney General. As Attorney General, he presided over the largest per capita executions in the world. Was he held accountable? No. He then was promoted to Chief Justice. As Chief Justice, he presided over and sanitized the inquiry into the downing of the PS-752 airliner, which Canadian courts have called a terrorist act. This same Raisi was responsible for whitewashing that investigation. Was he held accountable? No. He was made president of Iran, and he still is not yet sanctioned by the Canadian government. So this culture of impunity must come to an end, and we have the capacity to bring about the necessary accountability.
Sur la question de pourquoi ils n'ont pas encore agi, le gouvernement du Canada, sur cet enjeu-là.
Alors on doit demander du gouvernement canadien cette question. Nous sommes ici pour faire ces recommandations comme un cas d'urgence, comme un cas où le gouvernement doit agir immédiatement pour améliorer la situation et particulièrement pour donner une mesure de la justice pour les victimes et en même temps de remplir notre responsabilité.
Ask you, sir, this is also, I believe, the first opportunity we've had to speak with you since it was reported by the Globe and Mail that you were under 24-hour security protection. You do a lot of international work, and we can imagine that there are many things that might be causing that situation. Can you tell us, I appreciate there's a lot you won't be able to tell us, but what area of your work has led to this and how it's affecting you?
I can't speculate. When I've been asked about this, I said you can speak to the RCMP or any of their spokespeople, but I'm not commenting on that. And certainly today I want the focus to be on the question of the hostages and their families.
Mr. Housefather, you came at the podium here and called for the listing of the IRGC. Your government has been asked that many times. There's a former public safety minister on this stage as well, I'm sure, who's been asked that many times. Can you explain why the government hasn't made that move?
Well, I don't think it's up to me to explain why the government hasn't made the move. It's up to me as an individual member of parliament to exercise my abilities and my right as an individual MP to call on my government to do something. In the same way opposition MPs are calling on the government to do something, I think very often individual members of parliament lose focus of the fact that they have the ability to do a lot of things, not just as a member of a party, but individually. And I think we, as individual Liberal members of parliament, are calling on our government to act in the matter of the IRGC that ferments hatred and terrorism across the Middle East. And it is absolutely unacceptable that they have assets or people that are linked to the IRGC that are not sanctioned and coming to Canada. So I voted that way in the House. I've maintained that position throughout my entire time as a member of parliament, and I maintain it today.
Have you gotten any explanation, though, from the government as to why that's not possible?
Again, as everyone said clearly before, I believe the government has explained it, and my colleague Marco, when he was minister, tried to explain it. But I think that the main question for that is to representatives of the government. I'm not here as a representative of the government. I'm here as an individual MP.
Perhaps to family members of those taken, would you like to speak to what you're hoping to achieve by asking for these sanctions?
Well, the main thing is to make their life tougher. It's unbearable that they'll have fun, they'll have assets, they're getting stronger and stronger in Canada. They're becoming, with their assets, with their charity, so-called charity organizations, and so on, they're getting stronger and stronger in Canada. I am worried as a Canadian, because if Hamas and Iran, and they're all just names and organizations, Hezbollah, they're all the same thing. They're fighting the free world, they're fighting the values, our values. If it's in educational terms, if it's in everywhere we go, we'll find them if they grow stronger and with money. And that thing should and must be stopped. We can't afford them to be stronger. They don't share the same values as I share as a Canadian, as an Israeli. They share another set of values of hatred, values of death, values of taking their money and assets and training their soldiers to kill, rape. You must understand, it's the whole October 7th events weren't just an event that got out of control. It was well aimed against Jews. It was well aimed against women. They were trained, first of all, now we know it for sure. They were trained to kill, first of all, dolls, afterwards animals, and they're trained to rape. How to rape? What exactly to do? Those things are unbearable. It's quite easy. No money, no terror. And we should stop it.
I just want to say one sentence. Just to make it simple. What happened in Israel would go back to all the Western world, would go back to Europe, to the US, to Canada. What they did to us, they will do, using their own money, to do it all over the Western world. Very simple.
And another question to any family members who would like to take it. How would you characterize Canada's action so far on this issue, and what are you hoping to see next? Do you think that we've moved fast enough, in your opinion? We've heard it from government members, but I don't think we've heard it from family members.
Well, as we heard, unfortunately, the United States and Great Britain have taken steps forward and understood the total picture. For us, as family members, our world collapsed. It's not the same world. But also for each other Western country, because we were taught that Auschwitz was another planet. That was the testimony of a writer named Katzetnik who went through the horrors of the Holocaust. And we were taught that it will never be again. It will never happen again, because it was in another place. It was in another spot. It was in another planet. But it's not. It's not another planet. It happened in Israel. We sat in our offices, secured. Everything was thought to be okay. As we're here in Canada, we're sitting in our offices, living our lives. But if we don't do the things and the deeds that should be done against those terrorists immediately, it will happen here. Don't think the death won't knock on each other of my Canadian brothers. It will happen here, as it happened just not many years ago in New York at 9/11. It just happened. All of the sudden, it just happened. And if Canada will take the right steps, perhaps, and fight the terror, perhaps it won't happen. But if Canada won't do it, it will be here.
I have a question. I'm just wondering whether or not this group feels the fact that the death toll is growing so high in Gaza right now, whether or not that undermines or undercuts this call that you are making in terms of your calls for justice when it comes to Hamas?
It's very simple. This is not the issue. The issue is Hamas broke the ceasefire and just threw itself on our borders, killing our sons and daughters, kidnapping our sons and daughters. And we're here to speak about our crisis. What's happening in Gaza, it's a reaction of what Hamas did. That's the way I see it. Thank you.
Just to reiterate that we look at the whole question of the unconditional and immediate rescue of the hostages as a stand-alone obligation, unconnected to any other issue. If it gets connected to other issues, it diminishes and deflects away from the compellability of this as a humanitarian, moral, legal, international obligation, standalone obligation of the first order. And that's how we are approaching it.
Do we have more questions? Perhaps one quote regarding your question. At the same time that Israel is doing whatever it can do to avoid killing innocents, the Hamas had done the opposite thing. We find the missiles and the tunnels in schools and hospitals. In the same time that the people of Israel are struggling to avoid civilian casualties in Gaza, they were trained, and Hamas was elected by the people of Gaza, and they were trained to kill my niece, to kill citizens. So that's the basic thing, the basic difference. Because when the US and Canada fought against any other enemy, those countries made the effort to protect civilians, and that's the same thing that Israel does. The set of lies about what's going on regarding the casualties is another set, is a different, total different story of the Hamas. The Hamas killed. The Hamas killed my niece just after she was kidnapped and was took to Gaza.
In this group's call for a humanitarian response from Canada, does it exclude a possibility that there should be a humanitarian response in regards to what is happening to Palestinians in Gaza? I mean, Mr. Kotler, you are obviously an eminent expert in this, but it seems idealistic to think that this call can be made outside of acknowledging that there is a humanitarian crisis going on right now in Gaza.
I'm appalled by the question. We're here to have focus on hostages that must be released today. The assumption that you have made in your question is that there is some equivalence between the Democratic State of Israel and the terrorists that are Hamas. We are talking about a conflict in which was provoked, initiated, and sustained by Hamas. Hamas is responsible for everything that has happened since October 7th. Hamas is responsible for the torture these families have been subjected to. Hamas is responsible for the rape that was conducted across Israel. Hamas is responsible for taking babies in tunnels rather than shielding Palestinians in the way that they have a responsibility to. Hamas is responsible for all the violence that we have seen since. So when we are talking about the Palestinians in Gaza who have been sacrificed by Hamas, the focus needs to be on getting Hamas to stop its war on Israel, to stop its war on the Western world, to stop being backed by Iran, to attack their financial flows, their terror organization apparatus, and that's what we're here to do. So please, let's focus on what the families of the victims here are here to say, and let us act concertedly in a way that actually serves innocent people, the innocent civilians that have been taken hostage, and the innocent Palestinians who are being suppressed by Hamas.
Okay, I just want to thank the families for being with us and sharing their testimonies and the pain behind those testimonies. That's what has brought us together, this ongoing crime against humanity and our moral responsibility to act to redress it. Thank you.